Do you remember the Top Gear Lexus LFA episode and what was said about the digital ref counter? We're going to address this among other things being screens that all new cars seem to have these days. Are screens really necessary? Are they dangerous? And why do some car makers still keep analog gauges? I'll try to answer these questions today, so stay tuned. First, a brief history of screens in cars. Car makers experimented with them even back in the 1970s, and that included cathode ray tubes, yes, like the ones we had in old television sets. At some stage, Aston Martin tried fitting those in the Lagonda, which was so successful, the industry mostly stuck to good old buttons and knobs for the next 2 or 3 decades, and the most screen we saw was the tiny RDS display, sort of the size of a strip of Scotch tape. Bigger screens appeared at the turn of the century. Interestingly enough, it wasn't necessarily the premium brands which got them first as standard. An LCD display was standard on the 1997 Toyota Prius, whereas the Mercedes-Benz S-Class of the era only had an optional display for the sat-nav, and it must have cost half a Prius. Standard display on a premium model came with the first generation iDrive infotainment system in the E65 BMW 7 Series, yes, the one designed by Chris Bangle. To this day, the internet cannot make up its mind what was worse, the original iDrive or the Bungle Butt. Drop a comment what you think. It went downhill from there. Screens, larger and smaller, started appearing in various models. They were mostly optional, mainly for navigation. Some were touchscreens, but they were usually accompanied by a plethora of physical controls because, for example, AC was unrelated to sat-nav. The first automaker to go all in on screens was Tesla, and the screen race is on since 2012. The displays are growing bigger, and these days they even serve as gauge clusters. If the car maker chooses to leave something in front of the driver, for example in the EX30, Volvo followed in Tesla's footsteps and got rid of the gauge cluster. There is even no head-up display. Everything is on the central screen. The new generation Mini also has no gauge cluster, but at least the driver can see some vital information on the HUD. Also, Mini has a very good infotainment system, and the engineers were kind enough to leave some physical switchgear as well. So, what are all these screens for? Cars get more optional and mandatory safety systems and driver assistance systems. Theoretically, some of them could be operated with normal on-off switches, but there would be so many of them, the cockpit would be littered with buttons and finding anything would be as complicated as some infotainment menus are. Also, as options pile up, it's easier to have a screen displaying various features than to design cockpit space for different levels of trim and leaving blank spaces, for example. Back in the day, you'd look inside a Porsche and next to the gear lever you could see how many options the owner skipped. Also, today, mandatory safety systems require navigation data, so every car has a screen anyway. Okay, so screens are a result of the mandatory systems, but aren't the displays making driving more dangerous? Surely all this glare inside the cockpit at night isn't safe. It would seem so. However, according to an article I found on Autoblog, link in the description, the human eye reacts differently to different wavelengths on the visible spectrum. For example, the amber backlight on the gauge cluster in older BMW models was chosen so as not to strain the eyes at night. Also, red light is better for your night vision than other light colors. Speaking of other colors, remember Saab and its night panel? At a press of a button, most of the cockpit lights would go off, leaving just a green speedo. Apparently, green requires the least intensity to be legible. I wonder what were VW engineers thinking during the blue backlight era in those cars. But these were the days of analog gauges, and what's the deal with the screens? Here, the car makers have actually even more opportunity to fine-tune the wavelength, the brightness, and the contrast, as long as the screen doesn't reflect in the window, which it unfortunately often does. And then there's the menu logic or lack thereof. If you're not allowed to use your smartphone while driving, clicking through the infotainment system menus also must be distracted, and it sure is, as I'm sure owners of new cars with mandatory driver attention warning system found out. Isn't it ironic? And what if the screen dies when you're driving? Well, this is why there is already talk of making certain features accessible via physical buttons. I'm sure it'll take several years to implement, but there is hope. For now, regulators preaching safety created a monster. Screens may be dangerous, but not because of the light. Okay, since everyone should have mandatory driver aids, they should also have digital gauge clusters, right? So why do recently presented Pagani Utopia and Bugatti Tourbillon have analog gauges? Okay, Pagani has a digital screen, but it's between the analog speedometer and an analog odometer. Do you remember the Lexus LFA Top Gear episode? In the show, which aired in early 2010, Richard Hammond said the LFA V10 picks up and drops revs so fast an analog gauge wouldn't be able to keep up. It sounds like an oversimplification because analog data presentation is not a problem. Mechanical transmission of the data would be an issue, but for decades, the tachometers are electronic regardless of whether there's an analog gauge or a screen in front of the driver. Therefore, and I do apologize if this is too much behind the scenes, the Bugatti Tourbillon analog gauges are just theater. But it's Oscar-winning acting. To sum up, yes, the screens are necessary, especially in mass-produced cars where there are no exceptions for omitting certain driver aids. The screens are also cheaper than designing different dashboard layouts for different trim levels. And what was your first car with a large display? Was it a new car or a used one? Did the screen make the car feel modern or outdated? Was the screen working or maybe it broke during your time with the car, and was it expensive to fix? Let me know in the comment section below. If you like my sarcastic, down-to-earth and possibly mildly amusing car reviews, join me every Friday at 3 p.m. Central European Time, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video as it helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.